So have you ever had that feeling where you've been concentrating on something for a really long time and then all of a sudden you become aware of your body again? You realize that your feet are freezing, you haven't had a drink in 2 hours, you're hungry, and you probably need the loo. So in this episode of Thinking Differently, I want to explore how we interpret our bodily signals, how our modern lives condition us to ignore all of the signals that our bodies are giving us, how each of us have different sensory perceptions of the world, and how reconnecting with all of our sensory inputs can have a massive benefit to our well-being. I think this matters because so many of us struggle with emotional dysregulation, stress and burnout. And if we were able to better interpret the way that our bodies were telling us how we felt, we would be better equipped to manage all of those sensory inputs and understand what we really needed. So let's get into it. Hi, and welcome to another episode of Thinking Differently. So first I want to talk about the conditioning piece, the fact that society expects us to ignore our bodily inputs if they don't fit within what we're expected to do. So an example of this might be the fact that I have seen many meetings in a work environment where people sit down very still for 2 hours and not a single one of them gets up to go to the toilet. I don't understand how nobody in those 2 hours would have needed the loo. So obviously they're either dehydrating themselves before they go into the meeting because they know that the meeting is 2 hours long, or they are completely ignoring their bodies in order to get through this meeting because they're told that they have to sit still. Me personally, I work from home a lot, which means that on meetings, I always stand up and pace around. That helps me think, that helps me understand, that helps me process thoughts as I'm moving around. The idea for me of sitting very still while trying to understand a complicated idea or problem solve is completely alien. And yet this is what society expects of us, especially within the corporate world. And I think all of this conditioning starts at school. My almost 7-year-old now is being conditioned in school to sit very still for long periods of time, to only use the toilet during break times, to not feel the need to move his legs or his body around if he has extra energy. He's being taught that the best way to behave is to ignore everything that his body is telling him in order to sit perfectly still because that's what the teacher wants. That's what's expected of him. And obviously this is more difficult for some people than for others. The children that are currently seen as disruptive in class are normally the ones that don't have the impulse control to be able to sit very still. But that doesn't mean that all of them don't want to move. The ones who get identified are just the ones who are unable to have that impulse control to actually hold themselves still. And so I wonder why we do this. As a society, it probably goes back to this idea that we have to stay still because we need to sit on a factory production line and work and get the most output out of our time for our employer. The idea that somebody might need to get up and walk around every 10 minutes or might need to use the bathroom twice in an hour reduces productivity for the company that you're working for. Or that's the perception, at least. Although I'd probably argue that if you were constantly thinking about the fact that you were hungry, you wouldn't be as productive. And there's even that stat about dehydration. Even 2% dehydration can impair your cognitive ability, your ability to concentrate and pay attention and come up with new solutions. So this conditioning of creating an environment where you have to ignore your bodily signals is going to have a negative cognitive impact on you. Again, another prime example of this is I'm always grumpier just before lunch when I'm hungry. And I'm sure lots of people can associate with that or have seen it in other people. There's actually this really good research study into judges in the US, and they found that they were much harsher in their sentencing just before lunch than they were just after lunch, with all other metrics being normalized. And yet our expectation in society is that we can just ignore all of these factors. We can ignore the fact that we're hungry because something else is more important. And I'm not sure that we fully understand the impacts of that. And I think the more we tap into how we feel within our bodies, the more information it can give us about what we're doing. So for example, if I was feeling restless, it may well be just because I haven't moved my body for a while and my body wants to move. But it could also be because I'm feeling resistance towards a task. I'm feeling a challenge and it's really difficult for me to overcome this. Or maybe it's lack of stimulation. Maybe it's the fact that actually I'm just really bored and that's what's making me fidget. And paying attention to that would allow me to understand that I need to focus on something that's more interesting to me in order to hold my focus in place. I think understanding our bodily signals as well would give us a better interpretation and way of tapping into our emotions. So emotions are just the signals from our bodies interpreted within our brains. There's some really interesting ideas around the way that we interpret those bodily signals. For example, fear and excitement are probably the same feeling within your body. The shortness of breath, the raised heart rate, the slight sweating, all of those things are the same signals. And yet, depending on the way that our brain interprets it, we could see it as fear or we could see it as excitement. And so being able to understand the way that our body is telling us these things might also be a way into understanding emotions in a better way. One of the things that I always get asked in therapy is, where do you feel it within your body? What is your body telling you when you're talking about a certain thing? Because it can give me an incredible insight into how I feel about that I wouldn't have previously been able to tap into. And then there's also a lot of new and interesting research coming out around the way that our body holds trauma and emotional memory. There was this great thing that I heard recently on a podcast between Simon Sinek and Dr. Becky Kennedy, who's like a parenting psychotherapist, where she was talking about triggers and how we can't always be aware of where these triggers come from. And Dr. Becky was suggesting that actually we have a very limited vocabulary when it comes to memory. So memory, the way that I had previously thought about it, was things that I could put into language, things that I had a story about. So if you said to me, why am I sad about this thing? I would come up with a story and I would explain that when I was X years old, this thing happened. But that's a very reductive sense of the way that our bodies actually hold memory. And there's this idea that actually memory can also just be the way that our body understands to interpret inputs. So we might not have been able to synthesize that into a story, and yet it might still be a memory within our body. And she calls this unformulated affect, which is where something has happened to us, or something has happened to us numerous times, that we've just built up an overarching sense of this thing, but we've never been able to create a narrative for it. So for example, this might be something like, I always feel criticized, or I should feel ashamed when I act in this way. And again, normally these are things that have been created within childhood, where we've internalized ideas without being able to fully process them. And that's not necessarily through the fault of our parents. That's the way that our primitive and naive brains have interpreted a set of cues, and we've created a structure based on those, which has become something that sits and lives within our body. And in the book, The Body Keeps the Score, he also talks about this a lot. He says that the brain's initial reaction to trauma is often to suppress it through forgetfulness or self-blame, but the body remembers. The body undergoes physiological changes, such as altered stress hormone levels and changes in how our brain process information. So again, it shows us that there's this extra level of understanding that we can cultivate through paying attention to what our body is telling us that could potentially be really beneficial to our processing of past traumas and our processing of emotions, our processing of our internal triggers, and why some things really irritate us and some things make us sad, even if we don't necessarily have a narrative or a story to attach to it. And I think once you start feeling those things within your body, then you can be a lot more aware of whether or not you want that response. And I think the best example of this that I've had personally is the idea of adrenaline. So I was auditioning for a musical many years ago, and I was stood on stage and I was aware that I had to stand in the spotlight in front of the people, in front of the casting directors, and sing this song. And obviously I was really nervous and really excited, and I had loads of adrenaline pumping through my body. But I had to completely deny all of that. I wasn't able to move around. I wasn't able to burn off that energy, which is what my body was telling me to do. It was telling me that I was anxious and that I had loads of adrenaline, so I needed to just run around. But obviously that wasn't appropriate. So what I ended up doing is just shutting down all of the feelings within my body and standing perfectly still. But that meant that my back was really painful from forcing myself to stand still when all of this adrenaline was running through my body, and my arms went numb, which luckily is much better than the time that I was in a piano recital and had the same feeling, because then it doesn't work as well when your arms go numb. You don't need your arms for singing, so I got away with it. But it was an incredible kind of out-of-body experience of being able to be aware that my body wanted to do this thing, but it wasn't acceptable to do it, so I had to shut all of those feelings down. And again, I'm sure you will have had moments where you are frustrated or angry and you just need to move, but you might have been in a situation where that wasn't appropriate. So now I think I want to talk about how we can tune back into our body and the signals that it's giving us. So I found recently that yin yoga is incredible for me to understand what my body is telling me in terms of stress and tension. So because in yin yoga, what you do is you get into a stretch position and then you hold it for a really long time. I actually found lots of tension within my body that I didn't even realize was there. Now, whether that was tension based on historic events or whether it was tension from the day, I don't know. But by processing and by relaxing into that tension, it definitely made my body feel better, which probably had a knock-on impact in my brain and the way that I process things. There's also really easy things that you can do, like paying attention to your environment. For me personally, lights and smells and sounds make a big difference in the way that I feel. So by making sure that the light is the right brightness for you and that you're not being triggered into a frustration or an anger state by the smells or by how messy your room is, you can make a big difference onto your sensory perception of the world, and that will then have an impact on the way that you think about the world. Again, this idea that our thoughts drive and then our bodies respond is being proven now to be completely incorrect. It's a two-way street. Our body talks to our brain and our brain talks to our body. So even basic things like tidying up your room can make you feel less stressed, can make you feel less overwhelmed by your situation, and can help you get mental clarity on being able to solve a problem or work through an issue. And then we also have to understand that everybody's sensory perceptions are different. everybody has a different way of perceiving the world. And because of that, it's really important to understand that the way that you perceive the world isn't necessarily the way that everybody else does. And again, this is something that I have to do with my eldest all of the time because he's never cold. And so I, as a parent, want to protect him and ask him to put his coat on. But if he's not cold, then I have to understand that his sensory perception of the world is different. And by having a coat on, for him, it might be irritating, it might be bulky, it might mean that he can't move in the same way. He might then be too hot. So understanding that everybody has their own sensory perception and everybody has their own interpretation of that means that within a society, I think we need to be freer and more open to everybody being able to express those sensory perceptions in a way that makes them more comfortable. And I'm not talking about jumping up and down at a funeral, but I think, especially within the corporate world, there is definitely some flex and some scope that needs to exist, which could get the best out of people by giving them the things that they need in order to operate the best. And I'm not going to get all ranty about why I think working from home is much better than working from an office, because again, that's a personal opinion. But I think offices in general do aim at the generic. They aim at the idea that everybody wants to be in a bright, open plan office where they can interact with people and they can have meetings in big meeting rooms. Whereas actually, I don't think that there is enough thought that's gone into everybody's individual needs in those moments and whether or not you might be creating a detrimental environment for some of your employees and therefore not getting the best work out of them because they're unable to work within that sensory overloading environment. And I think the other thing that you can possibly do is just ask yourself where the discomfort is coming from. So the first thing is be aware of what your body's telling you. Be aware of all of the signals within your body. And then the second thing is then trying to figure out why that's there. Trying to figure out what the driver is and what that is driving you towards. And again, because the body and the brain are a two-way street, it's really important to understand whether or not I am angry because I'm hungry or I'm angry because I'm triggered by something else. So whether my brain has triggered specific bodily responses based on what it's interpreting within the world, or whether my body is giving signals back to my brain, which then changes the way that I think. And I think we need to break free of the societal shaming of specific traits. We need to break free of sensory judgment as well. This idea that people somehow are being weird by wearing shorts in winter. We have no idea what's going on for them. I am actually wearing shorts at the moment and it is winter. But we have no idea what's going on for them. Maybe they don't feel the cold. Maybe they don't like the feel of trousers on their legs. And yet it's always something that's common within society because it's weird or different. The idea that people might feel uncomfortable or fidgety, and that actually it's fine for somebody to be pacing around a room during a meeting if that makes them more comfortable and makes them more able to participate within that meeting. Or if that makes everybody else uncomfortable, then give them an area where they can do that. Let them be on a conference call and go for a walk at the same time. You don't always have to be at your desk to give your best. Oh, and then there's the gut microbiome, which is another incredible resource that is only just being tapped into. This idea that what we eat or what we've eaten a few days ago might make us really irritated today if we have a slight intolerance to that food is remarkable. And again, could completely change the way that you behave or feel in a given situation. Now, I don't know a lot about this, but I think it's an amazing area of research where we can look into it in more detail to understand exactly how that works, understand what works for us in terms of foods and the way that we process certain things in order to, again, optimize ourselves on an individual level. And then getting into what we do with all of this afterwards. The ancient techniques around separating your thoughts and your reactions is really key here. So lots of other people talk about this. The idea that you could have a thought and then there's a pause. There's a gap where you observe that thought before you then respond or react is critical. Because if we now understand that our body can interpret things in lots of different ways, depending on lots of different sources, it's really important to put that pause in the middle, to be the observer self and be aware of all of these things before we jump to a snap decision or a reaction, by actually analysing what's going on for us first and then giving ourselves time to decide whether or not that's the response that we really want. So meditation is obviously key for this, to be able to practice that idea of separation between your thoughts and yourself. But I've also found that breath work is really useful, because in breath work I completely separate from my idea of self. The ego state is completely dissolved when I'm doing it. And so it does give me this separation to be able to think through things at a more abstract level, and gives me the ability to tap into my body and my body's signals in the way that while my thinking brain is still going, it's a lot more difficult. I think breath work also helps me regulate my central nervous system and helps me process subconscious things that I wouldn't have necessarily been aware of if I was always working at the conscious level. There's also the idea of EFT, which has got a lot more scientific research about it recently. The idea that we can work through emotional traumas or difficult situations, and we can tap on certain points which in ancient traditions would have been called meridian lines and things, but actually are part of the polyvagal nerve, which triggers a parasympathetic response. So basically, by tapping on this nerve where there are more nerve endings, you can tell your body to calm down. And by working through the process of telling your body to calm down while you're working through a traumatic response or something that you're struggling with, it can reprogram your brain to interpret those bodily signals differently and possibly calm them down. So I think, in summary to all of this, I know I've thrown a lot of information out there, but I think the key for me is being able to take a moment and really pay attention to what your body is telling you. To be able to do body scans and feel how your body feels, and then be aware of that enough to try and make a change, to try and make a difference or an alternate. But again, awareness is the key. Without awareness, we can just be responsive. We're never going to be capable of making a change to the way that we interpret things. And so I guess what I would probably encourage you to do, if you were interested in all of this, is just be more aware on a day-to-day basis of what your body is telling you. See where you would have previously missed a sign, but now with thinking about it more, it might give you the ability to work through something in a different way. And I'd love to hear your experiences with this, whether or not you align with any of these ideas. And if you do start tracking your body and the way that your body is telling you things more than you were before, whether or not that makes a difference to you. And I think that's a great place to leave it for today. So thank you all for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.